everyone, and good afternoon, good morning, depending on which part of the world you're in today. We have a very international audience with us today. My name's Imelda Newton, and I'm from Arctic Intelligence. With me today, I'm very pleased to say, is Garry Clement. Many of you may have come across Garry, either in a direct working relationship or as a recipient of his international newsletter, or perhaps as part of the audience of one of his many international conference presentations. Garry joins us today and will be able to share with us experience that he's gained over his wide 40-year plus corporate and business experience, particularly in the area of financial crime prevention. So Garry, thanks so much for joining us today and co-presenting with me.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the opportunity and look forward to getting some feedback from everybody. I think this is for me, is something I think is critical, and I think it's an area that we still have a lot of work to do. So I'll leave it at that until we can get started.
Thanks. Well, it looks like we've still got people I can see are still joining in, but we will move on. Now, today's session, we're going to make as interactive as possible, or certainly as much as a webinar permits. We find that sharing information amongst the financial crime experts really is very valuable, and certainly in the interest of that community spirit. Today, we're going to run a couple of polling questions where you'll have the opportunity to have your say. Of course, all the responses are anonymous, so please don't feel shy when answering some of those questions. We'll only have a couple. Also, please feel free to raise any questions using the chat function, and we'll certainly try to address all of those questions. Now, today's session, we will not be focusing on what AML is. We have a very high degree of expertise and experience in the participants joining today, but rather we're looking at whether the underlying principles of the law are being addressed correctly. And particularly then, is your AML program preventing you from being the next regulatory penalty? And of course, the underlying principle that we'll be talking a lot about today is the enterprise risk assessment. After all, the law is risk-based. If the risk assessment is not accurate and doesn't truly reflect the nature, size, and complexity of your business, the subsequent program will not be fit for purpose, and how our program is operationalized will surely be less than ideal. And then any review or component will become just a rather irrelevant tick the box exercise. So in short, the procedures will be meaningless. We'll hear from Garry on how the automation of the risk assessment process is fairly fundamental in his view to achieving your obligations in an efficient manner. Of course, the economic effect of money laundering is very hard to quantify. But we do know that the proceeds of those criminal activities must go somewhere, and certainly banking products are a very convenient way. But there are other products that are a very convenient way for the funds to enter the financial system. We know money launderers are taking advantages of differences in country supervision, regulations, and disclosures. And of course, the damage not only undermines the financial system, but there's huge reputational damage at risk. So we always urge people to reflect on the social impact of money laundering. Much of the money laundered money is drug money. And we never forget about the drug ecosystem where there's addicts, domestic violence victims, damaged families, and so on. It's something we're quite passionate at Arctic, where we never lose sight of why these laws exist and how everyone has a role to play. And whilst it might only seem small, collectively, everyone has a role to play and can make a difference. So where did that passion come from? Who is Arctic, some of you may be wondering. Well, the passion started a few years back with our founder, Anthony Quinn, and his mission was fairly simple. How could AML outcomes be improved? Was there a better way to deal with the very basic fundamentals of AML laws, particularly the risk assessment? So he set about pulling together a team of industry experts to develop our solutions. And Garry Clement was one of those key members in his role as an advisor to the company. Garry, do you want to share a little about perhaps why you became involved with Arctic?
Yeah, I'd like to. First of all, everybody should understand that before I'll go on endorsing any product or agree to work with the product, I don't look at it from a point of view. Obviously, at this stage of life, it's not for me. It's not a profit motive. What it is for me is it's going to be value added and help us in what our obligations are when it comes to AML. And what I found unique about Arctic Intelligence, especially all their risk products. I happen to be doing a lot of risks or helping companies with a lot of risks over the last several years. And I came to the realization back about 5 years ago, and more so in recent past, that we really weren't doing an effective job on our risks. And a lot of it had to do with, because I'd like to say it was sort of like herding cats. Um, we were throwing everything on the table. We were putting it all on a board. We were trying to assess the risk. We were using all kinds of different Excel spreadsheets. And at the end of the day, we were probably more subjective than objective. And I think that's where a lot of organizations have found themselves in trouble. The other thing I found was that I think, and I think bodes true for a lot of people that are consulting in this industry. I'm not sure that we really have done a service, because the bottom line is, you have to ask yourself whether risk assessment is whether you can evidence to the regulators that it really does identify all of the areas that your organization, on all of the products that can be taken advantage of by highly sophisticated criminals or those operating in a terrorist financing environment. And so for me, when I used Arctic Intelligence and was asked to have a look at it, I found at least it was a product that, for me, it resulted in ensuring that all the T's were crossed, the I's dotted, and at the end of the day, you had a very objective process.
Thanks, Garry. And what was the result of all of that? Well, together with input from our expert team of advisors such as Garry, other consultants in the business, and also regulators around the world, we set about developing our solutions. And you can see here, where do our solutions fit into the AML life cycle? So firstly, we have at the governance side, so where you're establishing your risk assessment, managing your program, and then lastly, at the other end of the bookend of the life cycle is helping either consultants who are conducting their independent reviews and assessments of a program, so an organisation can demonstrate their level of compliance. Of course, over this time that we've been developing all of these solutions, we have seen changes in the market, and we've seen both macro and micro changes and trends evolving. Garry, would you like to comment on your view on the changes in these trends, both from this macro view, and then we'll get down into more of the coalface view?
Yeah, thank you. Bottom line is, I think what we're seeing today, first of all, there's no doubt about it, even though most countries and FATF recommends that we adopt risk programs and that the program should be unique to an organization. But the really where we're seeing, and I think this has come out of because of the number of institutions that have found themselves on the other side of the regulations and resulted in very large fines. And it's not the institution itself, and it's not individuals. It's just a systemic failure, I think, because we haven't been as effective as we should be. So what you're going to see is, I think, a far more emphasis on the type of risk program that has been developed by each organization. I think, and what we have to recognize, having been in this industry for so many years, the regulators have become as well educated as what we are in trying to stay on side with the regulations. And so don't ever underestimate where the regulators are seeing the weaknesses, because they attend the same conferences we do, and they hear sort of some of the systemic failures. So we know that with this, where we're heading is technology is going to be almost an expectation in the near future, because I think it's any of us that work in this industry recognize you can't do things manually anymore. It's become far too complex. So automated AML programs, we're in an era where all organizations are having to come to grips with what they're going to do when it comes to cryptocurrencies. And a result of it, we're seeing massive AML changes in laws. Beneficial ownership changes are on the rise. What we've seen is also huge fines for compliance failures, upwards of 400 billion in 2008 for United States. And I think one that really needs to be emphasized is the rise in personal accountability for boards and executives and the compliance officer. And I'm often asked, and I've spoke to very fortunate, I've spoke around the world, and I've spoke to a lot of compliance people that are 10 times smarter than I am. And we all, when we sit down in a relaxed environment, ask ourselves, why are we doing this with all the liability that's on our back? And I think really why we do it is because we really believe that it's an opportunity to serve the greater good of the community, to try and prevent money laundering and terrorist financing.
Absolutely. And then, of course, Garry, the folks who, as I sort of call it, at the coal face, often are the ones wearing the brunt of the day-to-day burdens. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, that's something that I think it confronts everybody that works in this industry, and especially those that are managing the programs. Without a doubt, there still is a shortage of experienced AML resources. And one of the areas, and most of you will realize that I was the executive director for a while with the Association of Certified Financial Crime Specialists. And the reason I got on board with them is I realized that just looking at AML and with our blinders on wasn't solving anything, because financial crime was really why I think the organized crime groups were being more efficient than what we were for a period of time, because we just weren't looking broad enough. And so we really need to, look at how do we get more trained resources. And I think and not just narrow focus, but broad-based experience. And I think we also recognize that compliance for anybody that works here, it's not a tick the box exercise anymore. Just the fact of all the enforcement and the number of fines that have been levied, compliance officers themselves have been held accountable. This definitely is something that needs to be worked on. The other area I would say that I still believe there's a gap, I don't believe that boards of directors have come to the realization that they need to have expertise on the board, just the same as they have financial expertise to do the financial accounting side of it. They need to have compliance specialists on a board so that they really do provide that fiduciary responsibility. The era of using Excel spreadsheets to do risk programs, I really, they are a dinosaur. I've been involved in it. It's a tedious process. But as I said at the outset, I don't believe that we are doing an effective job by doing that. There is, and I've seen it probably more so in Canada, because regulators come and go, and that leads to inexperience. And it was brought to my attention by a senior, very senior manager of a very large financial institution, who will remain nameless, that banks have, especially in Canada, have been they sort of work to the level of the regulators. So if the regulators aren't looking at something, obviously the banks are in the business of making money. Banks therefore are not looking at it. And it took me a while to wrap my mind around that, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. The regulators, although they do a fairly effective job, but if it's sort of like policing, if you overlook certain offenses all the time and it becomes common knowledge, you find that it becomes rampant. And I think regulators do have to up their game a little bit, especially in Canada. One of the things that has really struck me, and it struck me from reading a lot of the audit reports, many of them I've seen are from Canada, from FinTrack. I have seen a few from the US. And what really is interesting is that compliance officers, especially smaller institutions, have an inability to really explain in detail the risk assessment. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way they've been developed. If they're not objectively based, if they're not done in a way that can be brought up on a screen and show the methodical process and the objective process you go through, then I don't believe that you are able to explain the risk assessment. And I also believe then that the organization can't focus its resources on really where the risks are. So those are areas that I believe are really important to the compliance officer, in the areas that we all need to really have a look at and make sure that we shore up.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that, Gary. Well, I think now it's time to hear from everyone else. So for all our participants today. So in a moment, you'll see a screen will appear where you can have your say. Here we're going to be looking at, we've just shared with you about the concerns we're seeing across the market, but what are your top 3 concerns? So in a moment, I'll share a screen. You'll be able to have your vote. And then after we've voted, I'll share the results with you. So just one moment. We'll launch our first question here. Okay, so you should be able to see the questions there now in front of you. And we can all have a vote. I can see there's votes starting to come in. And it'll be interesting to see. We have run these polls across various groups in various locations around the world, and it'll be interesting to see, do we see the same similar trend we have in previous? So we have a few more votes to get in. Don't be shy, a chance to have your say. We'll let it go. A couple more seconds. We've got nearly have everyone in. So if you haven't had your say, great opportunity for you to have your say. And see if you are amongst, have similar views to your peers in the market and around the world. I must say, so I can see the results so far, and it is, yeah, quite consistent with so far of what we're seeing elsewhere. Still a couple more people. If you haven't voted, you still have a moment to do that. I think we might have some shy people in our audience this morning, Gary. Excellent. All right, so let me share these. We've got nearly everyone there. Let me share these results. I'll end the poll. and then I'll share the results. Okay, so what we have, here we go. So hopefully everyone can see that now. So around that 30% mark of concern that you wouldn't be able to defend your risk assessment to regulators is certainly a familiar stat that we have seen elsewhere. But I think the two that are really jumping out here are the concern of not using the most effective controls and efficient controls, and then also quite nervous that something is slipping through the cracks. So where you just don't know what you don't know. And they are similar concerns that are expressed elsewhere in the world. I think as I talk to different regulated entities, concerns around controls often comes up, and they have concerns about even how to test those controls to see whether they're efficient or even indeed appropriate. Garry, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that before we move on?
Well, I think it doesn't come as a surprise. I mean, 37% have stated they're still using spreadsheets, and I worked with an organization last year, and they still wanted to do the spreadsheet method. We spent in total, I just went in and we sort of set the next month's work, and I'd leave and go back. 7 months later, we were still plugging away trying to get an effective risk assessment. And then I grabbed the AML Accelerate program, and I was able to put it together in a week. So I guess that's why I think we really have entered an era of technology. And also, as I said, I agree with everybody. There is, I'm concerned that financial institutions, because of their size and their bureaucracy, are going to be too slow to react, and we're going to be dealing with third and fourth iterations of software that would be extremely beneficial before they even get around to improving the most basic. So that's one of my concerns, but this does not come as a surprise.
Yes, likewise, Garry, I share those views. Okay, so just as we're talking to lots of regulated entities, we often meet with the actual regulators themselves, and it's probably no surprise to you to hear that when you ask them what their biggest concern is, it is also risk assessment. So their concern is that organisations are not clear on what to do, despite guidelines that have been put out by the regulators. Might tell you something a little bit about some of those guidelines. But their concern is that organisations are not considering all the necessary components that they should be considering when they're undertaking their risk assessment. And the risk assessment, of course, has a great deal of components that you should be looking at. And so now the regulators are making it clear that they're going to lift the ante on the level of scrutiny that they're going to apply. Garry, I have seen evidence of the regulators lifting that scrutiny. What do you think is the real driver of that?
Well, I think what it's come down to is that there's no organization that's operating in this milieu that's immune from money laundering, terrorist financing risk. The other thing I think we need to accept is criminals and terrorists are becoming far more sophisticated. What people have to recognize is the amount of money that criminal organizations have behind them make it very easy for them to create various schemes and scams. And as a result, they're staying really, for the most part, a step ahead of us. So what does that mean is, organizations, and I've gone in and in my consulting role, and I've gone in and seen organizations that have the same risk program that they did 5 years ago. And I really question, everybody should be looking at their program almost on a yearly basis. You need a fluid program that's really accepts ongoing changes to your controls and measurements.
Yeah, that's right. So I think, when I do speak to regulators, they will talk about all of the different components, and I guess what to some will look like an absolute maze of different different risk components, groups, and indicators that need to be assessed. And of course, in that matrix, it can become quite complicated. And I think sometimes the regulators will think that they're putting out the guidance of how to do it best, but the guidance doesn't dive deeply into each category, each factor, or down to the necessary or recommended controls to put in place. And of course, then that causes confusion and uncertainty amongst the regulated entities. I think some people have had attempts at templates to try to address part of the problem with this maze of elements that need to be assessed, but then you do run into the issue of that they will degrade over the time during the lack of maintenance. So Garry, I know in your early days of working with Arctic Intelligence, you too shared this concern about the matrix and just this maze that was created. When you started working with Arctic, what was your advice on how to navigate this maze? And then, if you think back to our point of, how do you prevent the situation where you've got, a weak program, and hence then you could be, the next regulatory penalty?
Well, I think for me, what it was, when you looked at it, and I was able to look at the software that was available and then adapt to the environment or to the regulations that North America is in, I realized that it was really unique that you could, it really caused, I wouldn't say it's a plug and play 100%, but what it does is it really focuses your attention on all of the ingredients that you need to have an effective risk for each one of these areas, whether it be the environment and looking at all of the areas around the environment that you want to look at, your types of customers, your products and services, how does your business line operate and service each of the clients? What is the geographies involved in? What is the countries that you're involved in? You really need, and we all know, anybody that's done them by spreadsheet knows how complex it becomes, because when you start building these out, you can have pages and pages of material, and then you've got to try and make some sense of it. So what I really found unique was that I was able to take something that was basically gave you all of the measles that you need to weigh each one of the various products and services. It gave you all of the measles that you need to weigh the types of clients you have, all of the different channels that you operate in, and then all of the countries that you're operating in. And you can do that by each one of your business lines and run through it. And what I liked at the end of it, and I mean, there is more sophisticated, you can take them where it doesn't give you an objective score. You can play around with it. But the one I really liked, and I think is applicable to most organizations, is one that actually gave an objective score at the end. And for me, what I feel, and I guess only time will tell, but what I feel is that if I was a compliance officer in an organization today, I would have no hesitation sitting down with a regulator, walking them through how we devised our risk program, explaining how it scores itself objectively, and explaining how then we applied all of those measures into our controls that we needed for our organization. And that, for me, I think is paramount. I think it gets, if we go back to that questionnaire that you did, Imelda, I think that really gets rid of a lot of those concerns.
Yeah, interesting. So you talk about those spreadsheets. I think, well, it's time to hear from everyone else again. So what are the tools that everyone is using at the moment? We suspect we know, but it'd be interesting to get the feedback from our audience today. So same as before, folks, we'll launch the question. Let me just launch our second question. Okay, so you should be able to see that question there now. How are you doing your risk assessment now? We're looking at whether we're using any kind of technology, whether they be spreadsheets, you know, where we got those from, any other commercial software, not sure. Sometimes where external consultants are used, of course, they may have their own tools and you may not be privy to exactly what tools the consultants are using. So we've nearly got everyone, well, every one of our people who are not shy, who want to vote. Okay, let me end the poll and I'll just share the results for you. So very in line of the topics that Gary's just been talking about in terms of those spreadsheets, which are often developed internally. And of course, I think where those can come into problems then is, you know, maintenance. Authors have often long left the building and gone on to other organisations. And then, of course, where organisations are trying to consolidate and roll up spreadsheets is where we see a lot of errors then slipping into the process. And of course, then by using those spreadsheets, they're often actually introducing new risks around the risk assessment that is supposed to be there to help, you know, get rid of risks, minimise those risks. So thank you everyone for participating in that. I do have one last question for you before we move on. And we're always interested to know, what is it that has triggered that last risk assessment? So you think about last time you got that spreadsheet out to start doing your risk assessment. What is it that triggered that? And this is a question that often the regulators that we're dealing with certainly ask me, is they have a concern that organisations are not looking at all the various key business triggers and then undertaking a risk assessment when they should. So if you think about things like introduction of a new product, you know, an existing product out through a new channel perhaps, and maybe they've done a merger or acquisition, taken on a new customer base. And so the regulators feel that organisations are not doing their risk assessments as frequently as they should. Certainly our local Australian regulator, I was with them the other day and asked what they felt the frequency should be. And in their view, it was quarterly, which was an interesting view. A lot of folks have a view it only needs to be done annually. So it looks like, oh, some interesting results here. Okay, let me end that poll and share this with you. It was nice to see a good, healthy result there on we just do it to maintain good corporate hygiene. So regulators would be very happy to see that one. So everyone, for those who participated in those polling questions, thanks so much for that, for making the session rather interactive. It's, thank you very much for your contribution. Now, of course, we know where we're at this point in time, but knowing the predictions for the next 12 to 18 months is always interesting to hear. And Garry, I know you always have your ear to the ground, not in many countries around the world. So what would you like to share with us, your predictions for the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, I think, and I touched on it earlier, the rise of technology, I think the big challenge for everybody is going to be there is so much technology coming out there, and a lot of it's going to be AI based. It's going to be to have the depth of resources that fully can understand it. And secondly, to be able to maneuver your way through for most organizations, a very bureaucratic process in order to be able to use the AI, and hopefully that they're compatible with a lot of institutions that still have legacy systems. Automation of AML, as I said, I think the regulators, regardless of where you are in the world, are expecting to see more and more automation. It goes without saying the need for better transaction monitoring. And what we're seeing a lot of times is if you read any of the penalties that have been issued and you read what the circumstances were, a lot of it had to do with the lack or the gap in transaction monitoring. So that's an area I think that is going to be looked at. Cryptocurrency, you know, it's going away or going ahead in light years. There's a lot of things happening. We know about Facebook talking about having their own cryptocurrency. This is going to be really impactful on institutions and the whole financial sector, and where that's going to go, I'm not sure. But it's not going to go away, and I think everybody has to accept that. We saw, especially in Canada lately, with the requirement for more rigor around beneficial ownership, a lot of that had to stem from the systemic problems, and that's the only way I can highlight them, systemic problems that occurred in the casinos in British Columbia. It was something that I wrote about 8 years ago, and actually got challenged by the compliance officers at the casinos, saying no, they knew where the money was coming from. And as I said, if you're carrying in sacks of money, then it is criminal money, and that has proven to be true. More information sharing, I think that's sort of the new focus on information sharing. One other one that's not up here, and this is one that, especially in North America, is still a real sore spot within the legal community. They still feel that they should not be part of the AML regulations because it impedes solicitor-client privilege. I would challenge that in any court, anywhere. But I think one of the weakest links still happens to be our legal community, and we really need to shore that up. And regulators, FATF, are starting to look at, I know in Canada, they're looking at how they can work around the Supreme Court ruling saying it was solicitor-client privilege. So those are areas I think we're going to see a lot, or at least hear a lot more about.
Some good food for thought there, Garry. Thanks. So just lastly, before we open up for questions, we will be at the ACAMS conference in Vegas in around a month's time, so in September. So if you are there, swing by and see us. We'll be at booth 810. Love to catch up with you there. But let's open up for questions. Looks like we have some chat questions here. Let me just open these up. We did have someone who couldn't hear us well. I'm sorry about that. I hope that improved. Okay, we had a comment here from Sherry. So a third-party developed model, Patriot Officer for AML BSA, The model validation occurs annually or as applicable for all high-risk models. So I don't know if you have any comment on that, Garry, or we'll take that as a comment.
I would only add one thing. I think there's been some really innovative solutions out there by compliance officers, and my hat's off to them. But I wouldn't rule out looking at processes that have some AI capability.
That's great. We just had a couple other questions came in. I might get you to address this one, Garry. So what do you think the regulators are looking for when conducting an audit with respect to the risk program?
Well, I think it showed up in our questions, Imelda, and that really is first of all, I think there's a couple things, and one of them I think is really overlooked. The first one obviously is the ability of the compliance officer to sit down and walk through and explain the risk process and how it works and evidence that it's effective. That's key. The second thing is senior management and boards of directors knowledgeable on what the risks are for the organization. I've spoke to a lot of boards in recent past, and what's really interesting to find out is that the boards are, I would say, are really behind the 8 ball and not rely 100% on the compliance officer. My own responsibility.
Oh, I think we had a little break up there on your connection there, Garry. Are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, good. We just broke up a little. We did have a question from Mark about how much roughly does your software cost? So thanks for that question, Mark. So the solution there that you were seeing some of the screens from AML Accelerate is priced on a per regulated entity basis. So if you think about in your organization at what level you're doing that risk assessment, and we price on an annual subscription basis. It's offered as a software as a service, and the base entry point is $3,000 US per year. So that's at the entry point per entity. So that also includes all of your hosting, support and maintenance, regulatory updates and changes, and also country risk rating changes as well. So I hope that answers your question, Mark. Okay, and just lastly, one last question. Hang on, we've got another one here. Oh, great, thank you, Mark. So Garry, one last question for you before we wrap up. So why is it important to be able to evidence the in-depth risk program? So how, the linking between the risk assessment and the link in the risk program, I think is what the question's referring to.
Well, the bottom line is, and the longer I've been in this industry, the more I realize that a solid risk program done effectively really is the foundation for the whole AML program. And I think a lot of the times we forget that, but it really is the foundation. So therefore, the ability to evidence that what you're doing and what you've devised through your risk methodology and how you're implementing it and being able to evidence that it's effective is key. And that is where I think there's been a real systemic breakdown, is the ability to evidence that it's effective. And all we do is have to reflect back, and the number of penalties have been issued over the last 5-6 years, and those are systemic breakdowns, and those are the type of things that I think a really well-developed risk program, well understood within the organization how it works, can keep a lot of organizations out of trouble and keep the regulators happy. And beyond that, do an effective job of stopping the criminal organizations and terrorist organizations, because that's why we're here and that's why we do this.
Great. Actually, we've just got 2 last questions crept in, so let's just try. Oh gosh, we've got 3. Let's try to address these. So, Alana, you've asked, do we currently have any customers in the Canadian financial institution space? Yes, we've got our first Canadian customer just a couple of weeks ago. It's in the FX space. We've only just recently launched into Canada and the USA. So currently we have around 150 customers in 6 countries. So I hope that addressed that question. Garry, you mentioned AI. So Raza has asked, will using AI automation mean that new and unique risks are overlooked? And how can a compliance officer or a risk analyst complement the technology?
Well, I think what you've got to realize, first of all, I don't profess to be an expert in AI, but I happen to work with 2 companies that are heavily embedded with AI. I think what AI does, and it's really grossly misunderstood by a lot of people, but I think what AI does is it learns your organization over time. And by doing that, I think you stand a better chance of not overlooking something, because I believe in time it will become far more effective than it will be upon implementation. So I would suggest to you that how does a compliance officer interact with it? Compliance officer is going to interact with it because you're going to have the fundamental understanding of how the program works, and you're going to be constantly if new products and services are coming in, you're going to be putting those into the equation. The other thing that you're going to do is you're going to be able to look at the measurements that this affords you. And some of the measurements that this gives you are really unique. And believe me, I don't think a lot of organizations are able to do what this is doing right now. So it's only going to be time will tell how valuable AI is, but everything I've seen about AI, I think it's going to make our life a lot easier and make us far more efficient and effective.
Excellent, thank you. And just one last that snuck in from Galaxy S9. I'm not too sure who that is. So does the solution, or is the solution regime, so jurisdiction based? Yes, it is. So we currently have content for 10 jurisdictions, including Canada, USA, Barbados, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong, Ireland, UK, South Africa. And our next cab off the rank is the EU Fifth Directive. So we add in extra content as demand presents itself. And just lastly, the question around, is it able to support anti-bribery and corruption, sanctions and other fin crime and fraud? Great question there. So the solution that Garry's been talking us around today was the AML Accelerate, which does focus solely on AML. If you recall back to one of my earlier slides where our solutions fit in, there was another risk solution, a fabulous name called the Risk Assessment Platform. So that solution is able to cover any type of risk domain. So it's domain agnostic, and you are able to deploy your own methodology and model into that solution. So if you wanted extra information, my email address is there, melda.newton@arcticintelligence.com. Shoot me an email if you'd like some more information about how we would deal with those other risk domains. So I think that's all those questions answered. So everyone, thank you so much for participating today, and thanks so much for joining into our polling questions, and also asking such a great set of questions for us to wrap up on. I mean, if you do need any other information, or whether it's just to shoot the breeze on some AML issues, do let me know. Just contact me, and yeah, we're happy to address any questions that you may have. So thanks again, and hope you all have a good evening or good day, depending on where in the world you are today. Thanks very much, and bye everyone.
Thank you.